Oh.
Testing. 1, 2.
Amy Hatcher asked me to pass this around. They're looking for door greeters for the rest of the year. So if you could help, there's 4 sheets for the 4 months that are left in this year. Please sign up for that if you don't mind. My family will be gone next week to the conference in Tennessee called Polishing the Pulpit, if you have ever heard of that. If you've not heard of it, let me recommend it for you and your family. It's a tremendous event where there's classes and lectures for all different aspects of life, whether you're just a church member or a deacon or an elder or a preacher. There's kids classes, there's teen events on into the late night every night, several thousand in attendance, some of the best speakers that you'll find each year. And this takes place, like I said, starting next Thursday morning and through the very next Thursday. So look that up if you don't know about Polishing the Pulpit. I'm really not getting paid to make this advertisement, but we've enjoyed it over the last 10 or 12 years as a family. And I think you'd be blessed if you went. They do have a weekend that you could just go for the weekend and hear all kinds of good things. So let me recommend that to you. While I'm gone, Aiden is going to teach next week. We appreciate him filling in. And after that, I believe we'll have one more week of this class, and we'll be finished. And so I appreciate you being in it, and I hope that you have learned as much as I have, and I hope that it's blessed you. We're in the book of Esther, and we began a case study of some of the things that happened in this book last week. And so far we've looked at 2 lessons, I guess you could say, from the events of Esther. The first one was from chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, and we talked about focusing less on our lifestyle. We remember this king, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, who put his lifestyle on display to such a degree that it caused some problems, and it shifted his focus and certainly destroyed his family. If you want to call what he had a family, it certainly ruined it. The second thing that we talked about is the aftermath of that and how he responded when his queen would not appear for him and all of his drunk friends at the end of his party. And we spent a few minutes talking about how important it is to wait out your emotions. When you're angry or you're upset or something like that, it's very important not to let that become an opportunity for the devil. And then the third thing we began talking about last week was teaching our children about true beauty. Somebody in your own words describe the culture's idea of beauty, certainly the king's idea of beauty as we saw last week. All physical, all external, superficial. Does anybody remember what the process was for him finding a new queen? Yeah. The year's worth of beauty treatments, which I don't know. Does that sound appealing to you ladies? I don't know. That seems like too long to me. I need 3.5 minutes in the shower, and I'm ready to go. Of course, I don't have a lot to beautify, but
You have to choose from.
Yeah, well,
Starting from a pretty rough canvas.
I know you had at least one good option, because we're told about Esther's beauty in a couple of different ways. She was clearly physically beautiful, and that's probably the only reason that she made it through this process and ended up in this position. And obviously we're going to give all the credit for that to God, because God is doing something here. But you've got a very superficial view of beauty in this culture from the top down that is manifested itself in this process that selects all the most beautiful women in the kingdom and runs them through this talent show, which is a very kind way of putting what the king does here. And we started talking about the fact that maybe to a little bit lesser degree our culture is really pushing the wrong idea. And this is certainly directly affecting our young ladies and our girls from a very young age, from as soon as they care about how they look, which is earlier than you might think, they're hearing these messages about beauty and what it means to be beautiful. And it's affecting our young men as well, because they're hearing the same messages and they are tempted to focus on the wrong qualifiers when it comes to beauty. So it's a battle that parents have to fight and face and help our children with. What had Esther seemed to learn about beauty based on what we read about her in this book? Is she just fallen a victim to the culture she lives in? Is her idea about what it means to be beautiful completely based on what the king thinks of her? Or has she had something else that's helped her with that? Look at chapter 2, verse 7. Somebody read chapter 2, verse 7, and we're talking about Mordecai here.
His uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
Okay. So Mordecai has adopted Esther, for lack of a better term, as his own daughter. And the phrase here, he's bringing her up, is a very interesting phrase in the original language. And as you can imagine, parents, when you're bringing up children, I mean, it's a very short phrase to say you're bringing them up. But there's a lot involved in that, isn't there? There's a lot of concerns that you have. The word actually means to support, to confirm, to be faithful, to uphold, to nourish, to make firm, established, and sure. So this is not just, well, she needs a place to crash and she needs somebody to give her food and, make sure she doesn't get into too much trouble. No, this is a purposeful, intentional relationship that Mordecai has entered into here. His goal from the time he got her, whenever that was, until she left his home, was to do these things for her. And that's incredibly important, and that's the concept that we have in the New Testament about bringing up children in the what? The nurture and admonition of the Lord. Well, that's a mouthful right there, isn't it? There's a lot to that. And I'm sure that you, if you're a parent like me, you feel constantly, kind of falling short of that. And I don't know if I've done my job well enough. I don't know if they're ready. And can you imagine that when Esther was essentially taken away from him, can you imagine he may have had some of those same doubts? I don't know if I've had her long enough to teach her, to support and confirm and uphold and nourish and establish the person that she ought to be. I mean, she's not just being removed from the house, she's being put into a situation that I can only imagine is terrifying for Mordecai as her adoptive father, right? And so we can, I suppose, identify a little bit, depending on what stage of life we might be in, with how this must have made him feel. And but Esther is, in a lot of ways, she's ready, isn't she? She's ready for this. And so whatever Mordecai has taught her has taken root. And there's a lot of things that he taught her, evidently, that she remembers. But if you compare Esther, who was very physically beautiful, we're told that, to somebody like Absalom. Are we told that Absalom was a good-looking guy too? A very handsome man. If Absalom was in this room this morning, everybody would notice Absalom. He's a good-looking guy. If Esther was here, we would all notice her. These are people who are described as handsome and beautiful. But there's a big difference between how Esther seemed to carry herself as a beautiful person physically and how Absalom did it. Don't you agree? I would say maybe because of their upbringing, because of the way they were nurtured and supported and established and helped, that one seemed to think that his beauty could be used for what? For his own advantage. I'm going to use the way that I look and the way that people look at me, and I'm going to take that and, kind of use that to bless myself. While the other, Esther, decided to use hers for a greater purpose. Now, some of this is out of her control. She never would have chosen, probably, to be in this position. But she certainly handled hers a little bit different than Absalom did. 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, if you have your Bibles, let's take a look at this passage very quickly. 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So again, Holy Spirit in the New Testament prescribing true beauty, isn't He? Prescribing that, if you can be beautiful on the outside, but if you don't cultivate the internal person of the heart and let your beauty be based in that, then it's going to be perishable. It's going to fade, and you're going to probably abuse that. And so this is very important that we model this in the home. Our three girls are dressing themselves on Sunday. Can you say amen to that? Can you celebrate with me? They're doing it all themselves, and they come down, and sometimes what they have chosen, and I'm just talking about Willa, let's just be honest. What she's chosen to wear is just not great, and it doesn't match, and it's just not appropriate for what we're doing here on a Sunday. So sometimes you have to tell her, you need to go back up and change. But she came down this morning, all three of them did, and they just looked, I just had nothing negative to say. And Willa was standing in front of me with her outfit that she had picked, and somebody had braided her hair last night, and she had taken it out, and it was kind of curly, and she was just smiling, a foot in front of me, and I was just taken by her beauty, and not just the way that she had put her clothes on, but just her. And I feel that way about all of our girls, and one of the things we try to do is when we tell them how beautiful they are, we make sure to elaborate, because whether you pick the right outfit or not, you're a beautiful girl. And here's why. It's because of your heart. When we pray with them, we pray about their hearts, and we pray that they will continue to have good hearts and love God and love people and be kind. And so that's what you're trying to teach your kids. And it's hard, because culture's voice is so loud, and inevitably some of that's going to get in, right? Inevitably, they're going to care a little too much at some point about how they look. And maybe there's nothing you can do to completely, eliminate that. But I think this is an important point that I think Mordecai was successful at doing. I'd like to know more about what he did to help root and ground this beautiful young woman to the point where she didn't get used in the wrong way. Any comments about that before we move on? Brooke told me to look up when I asked that question, because she raised her hand last week and I didn't see it. Let me make sure I'm looking, especially at Brooke. Okay, no hands up. All right, let's look at chapter 2, verse 10 and verse 20. And let's notice another important part of this story. If somebody would read verses 10 and verse 20.
Her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And then 20.
And then 20, yes.
Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him.
Okay. This is a little bit remarkable. Not that she would obey Mordecai under his roof, but what? As queen of Persia, she would continue to obey Mordecai. That's the remarkable part, isn't it? So here's the lesson that I think we can spend a minute talking about. Obedience is a learned behavior that begins early. Obedience is a learned behavior that begins early. Would you say and agree that obedience is foundational to life? What happens, and we're seeing this, what happens when a person doesn't learn obedience, doesn't respect obedience, and doesn't obey anyone? There's chaos. What kind?
Well, they take it the wrong way.
Okay. Which way do they go?
They usually get into a lot of trouble.
Okay. Why? Why are we getting so much trouble when we don't obey?
Because if your only guide is your own impulses, that doesn't lead to a good place.
Okay. I think these are people who they misunderstand obedience. Don't you think that? We think obedience is a bad thing, a negative thing. Why should I have to listen to what anybody else tells me to do? When in reality, you're missing out. You're rejecting a gift.
Obedience is tied very closely to respect.
Yes.
Not only respect for the person that you're obeying, but also respect for
Yourself. That's a great point.
society.
And so we don't have a lot of obedient. When you don't have a lot of obedient people in a society, you have chaos. And this is a time in Esther's life, I think you would agree, when it's really important for her to listen to Mordecai. She's still young. She's probably in some ways very immature and very unprepared for the situation she's been thrust into. And so she really should listen to what Mordecai's advice is and and it says his command. He commanded her, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. And so why do you think she was willing to obey him? We saw the answer here, by the way.
Respected him.
Okay, she respected him and he brought her up to do that. And I think parents do this and there's so many good parents in this room, and you've already done this. You teach your children the value of obedience, not just by telling them what to do, but by showing them that when they obey you, they're blessed. That you're sending them, you're steering them in a good direction, in the right direction. If you'll just listen to what I have to say, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm not going to steer you wrong. I'm not going to tell you to do something that's not good or hurtful to you or that robs you of some kind of a blessing or joy. And so, obedience is a gift that we give our children that will serve them from then on, won't it? And sometimes we think we're giving our kids gifts when we don't make them obey. Well, I'll cut you a break, and we're all having a good day. I don't want to ruin it with obedience. You can do whatever you want. There's some of that happens, and that's really not a gift. That's something that ends up hurting that child. Go ahead, Caleb.
I was going to say, I think this is secondary to the point that you're making, because if we're looking at the reason she was obedient to him, I think that comes first. However, I do think it's part of God's providence that she just happens to be adopted by a man who is a guard for the castle. He understands the culture in the palace. He knows who comes and goes. He apparently is close enough to the king to thwart an assassination attempt, so he knows some of the major players going on there. And so his advice probably had a little more weight because of that as well.
That's a great point, and that's a great segue into what exactly we're supposed to be teaching our kids. So his advice, like you said, probably had carried more weight. What is it that we're supposed to be teaching our kids? God's way, which means that we should know it. And when we know it and we live it and we teach it, it carries weight. And because our kids can see, okay, mom and dad, they're trying to do this too. They're living this kind of life as well. And so when they say that I need to treat people in a certain way, or I need to avoid certain sins, they're doing it too. And I see the results in their life. I see the blessings. I see the benefit in that. That carries more weight, doesn't it? And sometimes I think, and I saw this a lot in youth ministry, sometimes I think parents think that their kids aren't listening to them. But I can't tell you how many teenagers who are away from their parents will still do what their parents told them to do. And I would imagine that if their parents could see that, they'd be like, well, why don't you show me a little more of that? But I would like for you to know that I think that that's a very real thing. That when you model and teach obedience to your kids, despite the fact that they may resist it, I think it's working. And I just want to encourage you to keep doing that. The best things we ever hear about our kids come from other people. Right? Does that happen to you? And you're like, are you sure you're talking about this kid? So I think this is a remarkable thing that you do your best, you do what you can, and then when the child leaves, you just trust that they got it, and that God is going to protect them, and that they're going to remember what you taught them and what you showed them. When you look in the Proverbs, you see this come up over and over and over again, and all of these verses are familiar. But if you train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's a general truth. It's not a guarantee. It's not a formula. But it's a general truth. You teach them obedience young. You teach them consistently. They'll stay on that path. And statistically speaking, we see a lot of evidence that that's true. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Discipline your son, this is 29:17, and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. I would imagine that's not always immediate. Right? It's not always immediate. And sometimes it feels like, man, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I'm not resting at all. There's no delight in any of this discipline, but the promise seems to be in the future. You teach this to your child and they'll give you rest later in life. They'll give you a delight when you hear the stories from their friends and their youth ministers and their college roommates and their parents about how good of a kid you've raised. That's delightful, isn't it? And that's something you can rest in. Ephesians 6:1-3, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Seems to be the New Testament equivalent of what Mordecai did, right? Just bring them up, nurture them, establish them, make them sure, give them a path in life. What are some things that Satan tries to tell us about teaching our kids obedience? Because if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? What are some things that Satan kind of whispers in our ear about teaching this to our children? Okay. Now, is there a parent in the world who doesn't want that? Don't you want your kids to like you? I do. I don't like it when they don't like me. I want them to be my friend and I want to be their friend. But I tell you when I'd rather have that. I'd rather have that when we're all sort of adults and going through life as faithful Christians. I'd rather be their friend then than to sort of fake some kind of weird friendship that's more based on what I need while they're under my roof and lose them forever. That's the horrifying prospect, and I'm sure you would agree with that. You know, we all want to be friends with our kids. Satan says, why don't you just do that now? You know, you don't have to have all this hostility between you and your teenager. Well, you might have to, actually. You might. If you really want to do what's best, if you really want to be their friend later, and story after story after story, I'm sure you could retell and maybe your own, that's what happens. Your kids come back to you after you have drilled this into them and they have fought you every step of the way. They come back to you 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later and they say, thank you. I appreciate this. I'm trying to do this in my own kids now. I'm sure this was not easy. Thank you for instilling this into me. So there's reward according to the Bible. But the Satan tries to convince us, you just need to be their friend. Don't upset them. What else does he say to us?
He speaks of things that are contrary to God.
Okay.
God says that he loves those whom he disciplines. And Satan tells us the opposite, right? You don't love your children.
That's right. He will tell you through the culture especially, you shouldn't be doing that. You should never discipline your children. You're going to damage their psyche. They're not going to develop correctly. That's really, those voices don't ever get through to me. I don't even think that has any, that makes zero sense to me, because I was a kid and nobody damaged my psyche. They hurt my feelings with that belt, but nobody messed me up. My dad spanked me all the time, and maybe I am messed up in some ways. Nobody make a comment about that. But I feel like it was the right thing to do. Every time my dad said, "Come on," I had to lean across the bed. My brother and I usually got one together because we were cohorts. And, if you were the first one, the guy beside you was just like, "I'm here for you, brother. I'm here." It was never fun. My dad never enjoyed it, but I have thanked him multiple times for raising me that way. Because now, when somebody in a position of authority tells me to do something, I respect it. And, certainly with my relationship with God, when God tells me to do something, I don't always do it. But I respect God and I listen to Him. And I learned that at home. And so, the devil says, don't do that. That's damaging. They're not going to like that. Or he might say, you can do that later. You can just do that later. You don't have to do that when they're little. Leave that boy alone. Leave that girl alone. Let them be little. I don't know about y'all's kids, but ours, from the time they were very little, were pushing boundaries. Anybody else's do that, or is it just us? 2, 3 years old, here, eat these carrots. If they could talk, I'm not doing anything you tell me to do. That's what they would say. And you have to start then. You have to. And we looked at each other and we're like, are we really supposed to start this now? I thought we had longer. But you have to. And Satan said, no, you don't have to do that now. Just enjoy them. Well, first of all, you won't enjoy that very long. You just won't. It's not enjoyable. But secondly, that's just not true. It's just too hard. Don't do anything that's that hard. It shouldn't really disrupt your life as a parent to discipline your kids. Satan will tell you that. This is too much for you. You got other things to do. Enjoy your life. Let them live theirs. It's all just lies. It's important for our children to learn this early. And however this happens in your family is however it happens. I don't know. I know what we need to do for each kid. And they're all different. For each kid, how are we going to teach this kid obedience? And it's a work in progress. But it's so important for our children to learn to obey others and not just their parents, isn't it? It's so important. I don't want, my kids' teachers in the future or coaches in the future or anybody, police officers. Hey, we had to arrest your son, which nobody would be surprised by that at this point in his life. We had to arrest your son. He just wouldn't get out of the car, or he wouldn't be quiet, or he wouldn't stop arguing with us. And, I don't want to ever hear that. I want to hear that, we pulled him over. He said, yes, sir. We had to write him a ticket. But, that's the kind of story I'd rather hear if I'm going to hear one. Let's let Brian stop him. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, he did. Oh, yes, he would. Brian Drakowski could make a point. So, very important principle that we see Mordecai by himself, single parent, adopted, not even a biological daughter, successful at teaching and instilling obedience with a very limited amount of time. I suppose he thought he had longer. But she snatched away. I don't know how old she was. Probably pretty young. The king wanted somebody young virgins. So, enough said about that, I think. Let's move on to chapter 2, verse 19. Somebody read verses 19 through 23, and then chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. It's kind of a lengthy passage, but chapter 2, verse 19 through chapter 3, verse 5.
When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther. Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when the inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of the Agag, and advanced him and set him in a seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded and concerned him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to him, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath.
Thank you, Dean. Let's take this one section at a time.
And notice two separate decisions that Mordecai made, and I want to see what we can learn here. Here's the point. This is a very different point than the one we just made. The point we're about to make is that it's important to maintain a balance between faith and politics. Okay? Everyone's favorite subject. Here we go. Chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. Mordecai learns about what? The plot to kill the king. Does Mordecai have any reason to hate this king? Political reasons? Military reasons? Financial, economic reasons? What kind does he have? Personal. It doesn't get any more personal than the fact that this is the same man who stole his daughter from him. Took her, dragged her off, sent her through this process, and now she's queen. He did that to Mordecai. Does he have any reason to hate the king? Yes. A personal reason. In fact, I don't think anyone would have been surprised to read, and Mordecai learned of a plot against the king and decided he'd just keep that to himself and see how things play out. Would anybody be surprised if that's how Mordecai handled it? Would you be tempted to handle it if it happened to you? This is the person who took your baby. This is the person that busted up your family and didn't even really have a good reason for doing it. So Mordecai has, I think, justifiable, humanly speaking, reasons to hate the king. But if Mordecai took the approach, just think about this. Don't get mad at me. If Mordecai took the approach that some Christians take toward modern politics, what might he have done when he uncovered this plot to kill the king? I just want you to think about it, because it does not, all of the reasons that we could get, well, we could say, well, this is why I feel this way about politics. Okay. I'm not disagreeing with anything that you might think or believe or say about it. But you got to give it to Mordecai that he would have he'd have a few opinions. And he'd have some feelings associated with this that are probably a little more personal than the ones we have. So I just think it's worth thinking about that Mordecai understood, and I'm reading between the lines a little bit, but not much. Mordecai understood, okay, this king's life has been threatened. I know about it. What's the right thing to do? Don't you think that's what he had to be thinking? What's the right thing to do? Do you think that was difficult? Maybe not difficult to do the right thing, but the process of realizing, okay, how do I feel about this? You know, this is the guy. I really don't like him. He really did something he shouldn't have done. But maybe Mordecai he's come to terms with this in some level. He's accepted it. Maybe he's even embraced whatever God is doing. I don't know how difficult it was. I know it would be for me to do something good and right for somebody who didn't do anything good or right for me, and maybe they did something that hurt me. That'd be hard to do. And so, you know, this in some ways is not about politics. This is about Mordecai deciding, okay, all of that aside, I know something, I can do something right or I can do something wrong, and I'm going to do what's right. And however that plays out in our modern relationship between, you know, our faith and our political views and our expression of them, and what we wish on people, and you know how we feel about people, this is, I just think, relevant, don't you? I just think that Mordecai is a good example. Now, in the very next section, Haman is promoted to the second most powerful position in the kingdom, and what does Mordecai do there? What's his response to this when Haman comes around and everybody's bowing down, paying homage? I'm not going to do that. Okay, so let's talk about that. Was this personal? I don't like you, Haman. Okay, if Mordecai did things politically for personal reasons, we wouldn't have read what we read in the first section. So odds are this is not personal towards Haman. It was, if I understand it right, it was customary and evidently acceptable for God's people to pay homage to kings. You see some of that in the Old Testament. 2 Samuel 14:4, 1 Kings 1:16. The theory that fits best with Mordecai's reasoning here is the idea that the Persians, and somebody may know more about this than I do, confirm this, but the Persians tended to regard this kind of thing as more than just respect or honor. They saw themselves as deity. They saw themselves as divine beings. And you can see some of this historically, especially with Xerxes. Haman is expecting something more like worship from Mordecai. And so since Mordecai is by all accounts a good and godly and honorable Jewish man, why is he not bowing down? Is it because he doesn't like Haman? It's because he loves and honors and obeys a higher power. So this is the tricky, difficult, and yet this is the balance on display here from Mordecai between faith and politics. Yes, there are some things personally I'm going to let go of because it's just not right to behave this way. But there's some things I'm not going to do. And it doesn't have anything to do with who's in office. This is just against what I have been taught to do by God. I'm not going to offer something to you that only belongs to Him. And so I think this is a really good example. Could Mordecai show respect and honor and common courtesy and decency to a politician that he had every right to despise? He could, and he did. Could he also take a stand, literally, when his faith was compromised? He could, and he did. You can have that balance. Why is that such a difficult line for us to walk? Because we have a lot of feelings. We have a lot of opinions. And we see a lot of attacks on God and morality and faith. And sometimes it's hard to know what to do. If you look at the New Testament, you find several passages that speak to this. 1 Peter 2, verse 13 and following is the most, probably the most quoted. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. You can read through verse 7 and get the whole passage. Now, all of that is true. All of that is in the Bible, the New Testament. But you also have Acts 5:27. We must obey God rather than men. That's also there. So, a difficult balance to be sure, but an important one. And here's why, based on these passages. We don't want the name of Jesus to be spoken evil of for the wrong reasons. Right? People are going to speak evil of God's people no matter what, right? They're always going to do it. They always have done that. But we don't want that to happen for the wrong reasons. Romans 2:24, we don't want the name of God to be blasphemed among the Gentiles because of us, because of something that we shouldn't be doing, because we've made the wrong decision in any given situation. Mordecai seems to have had a good grasp of the boundaries of those two loyalties. Does that make sense? I'm working on this. You're probably working on this. This is a tough time to have to make this balance, but I would also say it was probably pretty tough for him too, because he had a very personal stake in this. Comments about that? You're kidding. I just talked about politics and nobody has anything to say? This is wonderful. This is epic, historic. Caleb, you're just biting your tongue over there. Caleb, we'd love to hear.
We don't have much time left.
We don't have enough time? Okay. Well, see, I planned it that way. So, you have to listen to me, but we don't have to listen to you. Okay, so maintaining the balance between faith and politics. We don't have probably enough time to go very much into this next point, but let me mention it. From chapter 3, Haman is elevated to the highest position possible underneath the king. And, yes, go ahead. Okay, Dean.
It is a difficult place to find yourself when you see the fabric of society eroding away, and how hard of a stand to take, where to take a stand, how do you make the stand, how do we as Christians respond to the eroding away of family values and society in general, because we know that it's becoming worse and worse. Where there's so much single parent homes today, which causes so much of the distress. And so how do you? So what is our response to that? How do we respond to that? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that we shouldn't sit idly by it. I feel strongly about that, but I don't know the best way to make the. I think about making a big impact, and maybe that's the wrong way to think. Maybe it's a little impact that I can make, and encourage someone else to make the same smaller impact. And I don't know.
I would not disagree with anything you say. It is difficult. It's not impossible to know, what does God want me to do? Where do I draw the line between realizing that this is the world and therefore is never going to be on God's side, but I am. What does He expect me to do or say or think? Those are hard questions. I'm not suggesting that those are easy to answer, or that what I just said about Mordecai means that we can't do anything. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that I think personally, all I can do is personally be careful that I have a good balance and I have a good understanding. And I think everyone would agree, we don't want to let a wrong situation in the country or in politics, something that's going wrong that shouldn't obviously be happening, we don't want that to cause us to do something wrong. We don't want to respond in the wrong way. And I think everybody would agree with that. Maybe we should respond, but we should be careful how we do it, because the Bible still says what it says about government, whether we like it or not, and whether the government's good or not. It still says some things that it says. And I don't know the intricacies of government the way that some of you do. I don't feel as strongly about some things as some of you do. That's okay. We don't have to agree on every little thing about that. But I think we would agree in principle that Christians ought to be careful when it comes to the government and politics and our response and things like that. I think we could agree on that. We could hash out the details of what that looks like and how we should individually do that. But the principle is pretty sound. Yeah.
Be aware of what is our primary command in terms of reaching out to other people with the gospel. That's our primary command, not with politics. And how does what we say about politics impact a potential person that we might talk to about the gospel? Am I going to say something that means they're never going to listen to me about the gospel? Well, you have to think about that. I mean, we're Christians, people observe us, you talk about your children being aware of everything you do. Well, other people are aware of everything you do, right? I mean, one way or another, and somebody is, maybe not everybody, but somebody's aware. And are you impairing your ability to share the gospel with somebody or not? Because what's our primary driver here? My primary driver is not who sits in the Oval Office. My primary driver is that I serve Jesus.
Amen.
That I'm obedient, going back to obedience, I'm obedient to Him in every way that He describes, that I'm willing to share the gospel with somebody else, and that hopefully my example would lead somebody to be willing to listen to me share the gospel.
Very good point. And just so you hear me say it, nothing at all wrong with speaking out, speaking the truth, taking a stand against things that are wrong. I think God's people need to be that light and that salt. I just think we need to be careful how. So, thank y'all for your attention. I know that you'll enjoy Aiden next week.